Chapter 11 of Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 11. Albert the Good. The year 1861 was a black year for the Queen. On March the 15th her mother, the Duchess of Kent, died. She had been living for some time at Frogmore, a pleasant house in the Windsor Home Park, and here in the mausoleum erected by her daughter a statue is to be seen. She was sincerely loved by every member of her household, and her loss was felt as one affecting the whole nation. In the words of Disraeli, "She who reigns over us has elected, amid all the splendour of empire, to establish her life on the principle of domestic love." It is the remembrance and consciousness of this, which now sincerely saddens the public spirit, and permits a nation to bear its heartfelt sympathy to the foot of a bereaved throne, and to whisper solace to a royal heart. The death of the Queen's mother came as a great shock to the Prince Consort. The Queen was for a time utterly unable to transact any business, and this added to his already heavy burden of cares and responsibilities. In the following November the King of Portugal died. The Prince had loved him like a son, and this fresh disaster told so severely upon his health that he began to suffer much from sleeplessness. The strain of almost ceaseless work for many years was gradually wearing him out. He had never been afraid of death, and not long before his last illness he had said to his wife, "I do not cling to life. You do, but I set no store by it. If I knew that those I love were well cared for, I should be quite ready to die to-morrow. I am sure if I had a severe illness I should give up at once. I should not struggle for life." On the 1st of December the Queen felt anxious and depressed. Her husband grew worse, and could not take food without considerable difficulty, and this made him very weak and irritable. The physicians in attendance were now obliged to tell her that the illness was low fever, that the patient himself was not to know of this. The ministers became alarmed at his state, and when the news of his illness became public there was the greatest and most universal anxiety for news. In spite of slight improvements from time to time, the Prince showed no power of fighting the disease, and on the evening of the 14th of December he passed gently away. It is no exaggeration to say that the death of the Queen's beloved husband saddened every home in the land. It was a sorrow felt equally by the highest and the lowest. He died in the fullness of his manhood, leaving her whom he had loved and guarded so tenderly to reign in lonely splendour. In the dedication of Idylls of the King to the memory of Prince Albert, Tennyson the poet laureate wrote: "Break not, O woman's heart, but still endure. Break not, for thou art royal, but endure. Remembering all the beauty of that star which shone so close beside thee, that ye made one light together, but has passed and leaves the crown a lonely splendour." When one looks over the vista of years which have passed since that mournful day, it is with sadness mingled with regret, for it is too true that "a prophet is not without honour, save in his own country." Albert the Good was, like many other great men, in advance of his times, and not until he was dead did the nation as a whole realise the blank he had left behind him. Even so late as 1854, Greville writes in his diary of the extraordinary attacks which were made upon the Prince in the public press. Letter after letter, he noted, appeared, full of the bitterest abuse and all sorts of lies. The charges against him are principally to this effect: that he has been in the habit of meddling improperly in public affairs, and has used his influence to promote objects of his own and the interest of his own family at the expense of the interests of this country; that he is German and not English in his sentiments and principles; that he corresponds with foreign princes and with British ministers abroad without the knowledge of the government, and that he thwarts the foreign policy of the ministers when it does not coincide with his own ideas and purposes. And again, it was currently reported in the Midland and Northern counties, and actually stated in a Scotch paper, that Prince Albert had been committed to the Tower, and there were people found credulous and foolish enough to believe it. But English gratitude is always such, to hate the hand which doth oblige too much. These words of Daniel Defoe help to explain something of the attitude of a part of the nation toward the Prince in his lifetime. He had given his life in the service of his wife and his adopted country, but he was a foreigner, and the insular Briton, brought up in the blissful belief that one Englishman was as good as three Frenchmen, could not and would not overcome his distrust of one who had not been, like himself, so singularly blessed in his nationality. But time has its revenges, and the services of Prince Albert will smell sweet and blossom in the dust, long after the very names of once famous lights of the Victorian era have been forgotten. His home life was singularly sweet and happy, and a great contrast to that of some of his wife's predecessors upon the English throne. The Queen, writing to her uncle Leopold in this the 21st year of their marriage, says, "Very few can say with me that their husband at the end of 21 years is not only full of the friendship, kindness and affection which a truly happy marriage brings with it, but the same tender love of the very first days of our marriage." The Prince, in a letter to a friend, rejoiced that their marriage still continues green and fresh, and throws out vigorous roots, from which I can, with gratitude to God, acknowledge that much good will yet be engendered for the world. The finest tribute to the Prince Consort's memory is to be found in the dedication, written by Lord Tennyson, to his Idylls of the King. These to his memory, since he held them dear, perchance as finding there unconsciously some image of himself, I dedicate, I consecrate with tears these ideals. Like Arthur, the flower of kings, he was a man of ideals, above petty jealousies and small ambitions. Hereafter, through all times, Albert the Good. The ideals produced such a deep impression upon the Prince that he wrote to the author, asking him to inscribe his name in the volume. The book remained always a great favourite with him, and Princess Frederick William was engaged upon a series of pictures illustrating her favourite passages at the time of his death. An enumeration of the varied activities of Prince Albert during his lifetime would need a volume. His position was always a difficult one, and was seldom made easy by the section of the press which singled him out as a target for its poisoned arrows. Only a strong sense of duty and an unwavering belief in his wife's love could have sustained him through the many dark hours of tribulation and sorrow. He rose early all the year round, and prepared drafts of answers to the Queen's ministers, wrote letters, and had cleared off a considerable amount of work before many men would have thought of beginning the day's tasks. Albert Memorial. The Albert Memorial. No article of any importance in the newspapers or magazines escaped his attention. Every one appealed to him for help or advice, and none asked in vain. His wide knowledge and judgment were freely used by the Queen's statesmen, and the day proved all too short for the endless amount of work which had to be done. In spite of increasing burdens and poor health, he was always in good spirits. At breakfast and at luncheon, and also at our family dinners, he sat at the top of the table, and kept us all enlivened by his interesting conversation, by his charming anecdotes, and droll stories without end of his childhood, of people at Coburg, of our good people in Scotland, which he would repeat with a wonderful power of mimicry, and at which he would himself laugh most heartily. Then he would at other times entertain us with his talk about the most interesting and important topics of the present and of former days, on which it was ever a pleasure to hear him speak. His rule in life was to make his position entirely a part of the Queen's, to place all his time and powers at her command. Every speech which he made in public was carefully considered beforehand, and then written out and committed to memory. As he had to speak in a foreign tongue, he considered this precaution absolutely necessary. At the same time, it often made him feel shy and nervous when speaking before strangers, and this sometimes gave to those who did not know him a mistaken impression of coldness and reserve. His sympathy with the working classes was sincere and practical. He was convinced that any real improvement must be the result of the exertion of the working people themselves. He was president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes, and never lost an opportunity of pointing out that, to quote his own words, "The royal family are not merely living upon the earnings of the people, as these publications try to represent, without caring for the poor labourers, but that they are anxious about their welfare and ready to co-operate in any scheme for the amelioration of their condition. We may possess these feelings, and yet the mass of the people may be ignorant of it, because they have never heard it expressed to them, or seen any tangible proof of it. His grasp of detail and knowledge of home and foreign political affairs astonished everyone who met him, ministers and ambassadors alike. His writing table and that of the Queen stood side by side in their sitting room, and here they used to work together, every dispatch which left their hands being the joint work of both. The Prince corrected and revised everything carefully before it received the Queen's signature. Considering the small amount of time at his disposal, it was remarkable how much he was able to read, and read thoroughly, both with the Queen and by himself. Not many, but much, was his principle, and every book read was carefully noted in his diary. Even to the last he exerted his influence in the cause of peace. The American Civil War broke out in 1861, and Great Britain declared her neutrality, but an incident known as the Trent affair nearly brought about a declaration of war. The Southern States, or Confederates, as they were usually called, sent 2 commissioners to Europe on board the British mail steamer Trent. The Trent was fired upon and boarded by a Federal officer, who arrested the commissioners. This was regarded as an insult to our flag, as it was a breach of international law to attack the ship of a neutral power. The Government therefore decided to demand redress, and a dispatch, worded by Palmerston, was forwarded to the Queen for her signature. The Prince realised at once that if the dispatch were forwarded as it was written, it would lead to open war between the Northern States and our country, and he suggested certain alterations to the Queen, who agreed to them. A more courteously worded message was sent, and the Northern States at once agreed to liberate the commissioners and offered an ample apology. End of chapter 11. of Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 12. Friends and Advisers. Possibly the person to whom the Queen owed most, next to her husband, was Lord Melbourne. His position at the time when the young Queen came to the throne was a unique one. Victoria was just 18 years of age. That is to say, if she had been a little younger, it would have been necessary to appoint a regent until such time as she came of age. For many years it had been a matter of certainty that she would succeed to the throne, and the late King's unreliable temper had been the means of preventing the matter from being properly arranged as regards certain advantages which might have been given to the Princess during his lifetime. In many ways, however, it was fortunate that the Queen came to the throne at such an early age. If her knowledge of state politics was small, she possessed at any rate a well-trained mind, a sense of duty, and a clear idea as to the responsibilities of her position as ruler of a great nation. There had been 4 reigning queens in the country before Victoria, but all of them had had some previous training for their duties. The 2 Tudor queens came of a ruling stock, and were older in years and experience. The times, too, were very different. Queen Elizabeth, for example, before coming to the throne, possessed an intimate knowledge of political affairs, and experience. She had been confined in the Tower of London and narrowly escaped losing her head, had endowed her with the wisdom of the serpent. The 2 Stuart queens were no longer young, and both were married. The circumstances, in the case of the young Victoria, were thus totally different. She stood alone, and it was clear that someone must help her to grapple with the 1001 difficulties which surrounded her. It was for some time uncertain who would undertake the duty, until almost before he had realised it himself, Lord Melbourne found himself in the position of guide, philosopher and friend. How he devoted himself to this work can be judged from the fact that no one, not even any of his opponents, regarded him with the slightest mistrust or jealousy. Melbourne was at this time 58 years of age, an honourable, honest-hearted Englishman. He was sympathetic by nature, fond of female society, and in addition was devoted to the Queen. His manner toward her was always charming, and he was in constant attendance upon her. Nor was the training which the Queen received from him limited to politics, but matters of private interest were often discussed. Every morning he brought dispatches with him to be read and answered. After the midday meal he went out riding with her, and whenever his parliamentary duties allowed, he was to be found at her side at the dinner table. When he retired from office, he was able to state with pride that he had seen his sovereign every day during the past 4 years. The news of her engagement to Prince Albert was received by him with the keenest pleasure, and the Queen in writing to her uncle says, "Lord Melbourne, whom I of course have consulted about the whole affair, quite approves my choice, and expresses great satisfaction at the event, which he thinks in every way highly desirable. Lord Melbourne has acted in this business, as he has always done toward me, with the greatest kindness and affection." It was a real wrench to the Queen when the time for parting came. Melbourne, with his easy-going nature and somewhat free and easy language, had schooled himself as well as his young pupil, and had become a friend as well as an adviser. Some words of Greville's might aptly serve for this great statesman's epitaph: "It has been his providence to educate, instruct, and form the most interesting mind and character in the world. No occupation was ever more engrossing, or involved greater responsibility. It is fortunate that she has fallen into his hands, and that he discharges this great duty wisely, honourably, and conscientiously." The Queen was equally fortunate in his successor, Sir Robert Peel, a statesman for whom she had every confidence and respect, a man who thinks but little of party and never of himself. Peel was never afraid of making up his mind and then sticking to his plan of action, although, as often happened, it brought him into opposition with members of his own party. In his hands both the Queen and her husband felt that the interests of the Crown were secure. Peel naturally felt considerable embarrassment on first taking up office, as he had given support in the previous year to a motion which proposed cutting down the Prince's income. But the Prince felt no resentment, and so frank and cordial was his manner, that Peel, following Lord Melbourne's lead, continued to keep him from day to day thoroughly in touch with the course of public affairs. The relations between the Queen and her minister were cordial in the extreme. Peel appreciated very fully her simple domestic tastes, and he was able, at a later date, to bring before her notice Osborne, which might serve as a loophole of retreat from the noise and strife and questions wearisome. The Queen was delighted with the estate. It is impossible to see a prettier place, with woods and valleys and points de vue which would be beautiful anywhere. But when these are combined with the sea, to which the woods grow down, and a beach which is quite private, it is really everything one could wish. In 1845 the Queen asked Lord Aberdeen if she could not show in some way her appreciation of the courage with which Sir Robert Peel had brought forward and supported 2 great measures in the face of tremendous opposition. She suggested that he should be offered the Order of the Garter, the highest distinction possible. Sir Robert Peel's reply was that he would much prefer not to accept any reward at all. He sprang, he said, from the people, and such a great honour in his case was out of the question. The only reward he asked for was Her Majesty's confidence, and so long as he possessed that, he was content. When his ministry came to an end, the Prince wrote to him, begging that their relations should not on that account cease. Sir Robert replied, thanking him for the considerate kindness and indulgence he had received at their hands, and regretting that he should no longer be able to correspond so frequently as before. The Prince and he were in the fullest sympathy in matters of politics, art, and literature, and Peel had supported the Prince loyally through all the anxieties connected with the arrangements for the Great Exhibition. His death in 1850 was a calamity. Prince Albert in a letter speaks of Peel as the best of men, our truest friend, the strongest bulwark of the throne, the greatest statesman of his time. The Duke of Wellington said in the Upper House: "In all the course of my acquaintance with Sir Robert Peel, I never knew a man in whose truth and justice I had a more lively confidence, or in whom I saw a more invariable desire to promote the public service. In the whole course of my communications with him, I never knew an instance in which he did not show the strongest attachment to truth, and I never saw in the whole course of my life the slightest reason for suspecting that he stated anything which he did not believe to be the fact." The Queen, writing to her uncle, said that Albert felt and feels Sir Robert's loss dreadfully. He feels he has lost a second father. As a statesman it was said of him that "for concocting, producing, explaining, and defending measures he had no equal, or anything like an equal." By far the most interesting person who acted as both friend and adviser to the Queen and her husband was the Baron Christian Friedrich von Stockmar, who had been private physician to Prince Leopold, and afterward private secretary and controller of his household. He took an active part in the negotiations which led to his master becoming King of the Belgians. Long residence in this country had given him a thorough knowledge of England and the English, and he claimed friendship with the leading diplomatists both at home and on the European continent. In 1834 he retired to Coburg, but later was chosen, as we have seen, to lend his valuable advice toward bringing about a union between Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, both of whom he knew and admired. Immediately before Victoria's accession, King Leopold had sent him to England, where his counsel, judgment, and thorough knowledge of the English constitution were placed at the service of the young princess. He accompanied Prince Albert on a tour in Italy, and again returned to England to make arrangements for the prince's future household. All that he did during this period was done quietly and behind the scenes, and though he was a foreigner by birth, he worked to bring about the marriage for the sake of the country he loved so well. He looked upon England as the home of political freedom. Out of its bosom, he stated, singly and solely has sprung America's free constitution, in all its present power and importance, in its incalculable influence upon the social condition of the whole human race, and in my eyes the English constitution is the foundation, corner, and copestone of the entire political civilization of the human race, present and to come. He soon became the Prince's confidential adviser, and his unrivalled knowledge and strict sense of truth and duty proved of the utmost value. He endeared himself to both the Queen and the Prince, and successive statesmen trusted him absolutely for his freedom from prejudice and for his sincerity. In 1842 he drew up for the Queen some rules for the education of her children. "A man's education begins the first day of his life," was one of his maxims. He insisted that "the education of the royal infants ought to be from its earliest beginning a truly moral and a truly English one. The persons to whom the children are entrusted should receive the full support and confidence of the parents, otherwise education lacks its very soul and vitality." He suggested that a lady of rank should be placed at the head of the nursery, as being better able to understand the responsibilities and duties attached to the education and upbringing of the Queen's children. His advice was again taken when it was necessary to settle upon what plan the young Prince of Wales should be educated. Stockmar's judgment of men was singularly correct and just. He formed the highest opinion of Sir Robert Peel, and on the Duke of Wellington's death in 1852 he wrote in a letter to the Prince a masterly analysis of the great commander's character, concluding with these words: "As the times we live in cannot fail to present your Royal Highness with great and worthy occasions to distinguish yourself, you should not shrink from turning them to account as Wellington did, for the good of all, yet without detriment to yourself." The Prince corresponded regularly with the good Stockmar, and always in time of doubt and trial came sage counsel from his trusted friend. In fact, the Prince took both the Queen and his friend equally into his confidence. They were the two to whom he could unbosom himself with entire freedom. Disraeli, afterward Lord Beaconsfield, obtained the Queen's fullest confidence, and won her friendship to an extent which no minister since Melbourne had ever been able to do. Dizzy, the leader of the Young England party, the writer of political novels, was a very different person from the statesman of later years. It is difficult to remember or to realise in these days that it was looked upon as something quite extraordinary for a member of a once despised and persecuted race, the Jews, to hold high office. The annual celebrations of Primrose Day, April 19th, the anniversary of his death, are sufficient proof that this great statesman's services to the British Empire are not yet forgotten. Lord Beaconsfield, whom she regarded with sincere affection, possessed a remarkable influence over the Queen, for the simple reason that he never forgot to treat her as a woman. He was noted throughout his life for his chivalry to the opposite sex, and his devotion to his wife was very touching. He was a firm believer in the power of the Crown for good. The proper leader of the people, he declared, is the individual who sits upon the throne. He wished the sovereign to be in a position to rule as well as to reign, to be at one with the nation, above the quarrels and differences of the political parties, and to be their representative. When quite a young man, he declared that he would one day be Prime Minister, and with this end in view he entered Parliament against the wishes of his family. He was an untiring worker all his life, and a firm believer in action. Act, act, act without ceasing, and you will no longer talk of the vanity of life, was his creed. His ideas on education were original, and he did everything in his power to improve the training of the young. In 1870 he supported the great measure for a scheme of national education. Some years earlier he declared that "it is an absolute necessity that we should study to make every man the most effective being that education can possibly constitute him." In the old wars there used to be a story that one Englishman could beat 3 members of some other nation, but I think if we want to maintain our power we ought to make one Englishman equal really in the business of life to 3 other men that any other nation can furnish. I do not see otherwise how we can fulfil the great destiny that I believe awaits us, and the great position we occupy. He did more than any other minister to raise the Crown to the position it now occupies, and no monarch ever had a more devoted and faithful servant. His high standard of morals and his force of character especially appealed to the English people, and his loyalty to his friends and colleagues remained unshaken throughout his whole life. He impressed not only his own countrymen, but also foreigners, with his splendid gifts of imagination and foresight. Bismarck, the man of blood and iron, who welded the disunited states of Germany into a united and powerful empire, considered that Queen Victoria was the greatest statesman in Europe, and of the great Beaconsfield he said, "Disraeli is England." Disraeli was a master of wit and phrase, and many of his best sayings and definitions have become proverbial. For example, the hansom, the gondola of London, our young Queen and our old institutions, critics, men who have failed, books, the curse of the human race. The central figure of his time was the statesman warrior, the great Duke of Wellington, the Duke. After the famous Marlborough, England had not been able to boast of such a great commander. He was the best known figure in London, and though he never courted popularity or distinction, yet he served his Queen as Prime Minister when desired. The path of duty was for him the way to glory. In 1845 the greatest wish of his life was realised, when the Queen and her husband paid him a 2 days' visit at his residence, Strathfieldsaye. Alfred Tennyson's Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington in 1852 praises him as truth-teller and truth-lover, and mourns for him. Let the long, long procession go, and let the sorrowing crowd about it grow, and let the mournful martial music blow. The last great Englishman is low. In striking contrast to the Iron Duke was the man whom Disraeli could never learn to like, Lord John Russell. Generally depicted in the pages of Punch as a pert, cocksure little fellow, Little Johnny, the leader of the Whig party, was a power as a leader. He knew how to interpret the Queen's wishes in a manner agreeable to herself, yet he did not hesitate when he thought it advisable to speak quite freely in criticism of her actions. His ancestors in the Bedford family had in olden days been advisers of the Crown, and Lord John thus came of a good stock. He himself, nevertheless, was always alert to prevent any encroachment upon the growing powers and rights of the people. He was a favourite of the Queen, and she gave him as a residence a house and grounds in Richmond Park. He was a man of the world, and an agreeable talker, very well read, fond of quoting poetry, and especially pleased if he could indulge in reminiscences in his own circle of what his royal mistress had said at her last visit. Finally, mention must be made of one who, though he held no high position of state, can with justice be regarded as both friend and adviser of the Queen, John Browne. He entered the Queen's service at Balmoral, became later a gillie to the Prince Consort, and in 1851 the Queen's personal outdoor attendant. He was a man of a very straightforward nature and blunt speech, and even his royal mistress was not safe at times from criticism. In spite of his rough manner, he possessed many admirable qualities, and on his death in 1883 the Queen caused a granite seat to be erected in the grounds of Osborne, with the following inscription: "A truer, nobler, trustier heart, more loving and more loyal, never beat within a human breast." End of chapter 12. Of Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 13. Queen and Empire. What should they know of England who only England know? The England of Queen Elizabeth was the England of Shakespeare. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. In Tennyson's Princess we find an echo of these words, where the poet, in contrasting England and France, monarchy and republic, much to the disadvantage of the latter, says: "God bless the narrow sea which keeps her off, and keeps our Britain whole within herself, a nation yet, the rulers and the ruled." But at a later date, in an epilogue to the Queen, at the close of the Idylls of the King, Tennyson has said farewell to his narrow insular views, and speaks of "our ocean empire with her boundless homes, for ever broadening England and her throne, in our vast Orient, and one isle, that knows not her own greatness, if she knows, and dreads it, we are fallen." He had come to recognise the necessity for guarding and maintaining the Empire, with all its greatness and all its burdens, as part of this country's destiny. It is a little difficult to realise that the British Empire, as we now know it, has been created within only the last 100 years. Beaconsfield, in his novel Contarini Fleming, describes the difference between ancient and modern colonies. A modern colony, he says, is a commercial enterprise. An ancient colony was a political sentiment. In other words, colonies were a matter of cash to modern nations, such as the Spaniards. In the time of the ancients there was a close tie, a feeling of kinship, and the colonist was not looked upon with considerable contempt and dislike by the mother country. Beaconsfield believed that there would come a time, and that not far distant, when men would change their ideas. I believe that a great revolution is at hand in our system of colonisation, and that Europe will soon recur to the principles of the ancient polity. This feeling of pride in the growth and expansion of our great overseas dominions is comparatively new, and there was a time when British ministers seriously proposed separation from what they considered to be a useless burden. The ignorance of all that concerned the colonies in the early years of Victoria's reign was extraordinary, and this accounted, to a great extent, for the indifference with which the English people regarded the prospect of drifting apart. Lord Beaconsfield was a true prophet, for this indifference is now a thing of the past, and in the year 1875 an Imperial Federation League was formed, which, together with the celebrations at the Jubilees in 1887 and 1897, helped to knit this country and the Dominions together in bonds of friendship and sympathy. The rapid improvements in communication have brought the different parts of the Empire closer together. The Imperial penny postage and an all-British cable route to Australia have kept us in constant touch with our kinsmen in every part of the world where the Union Jack is flown. But this did not all come about in a day. Prejudice and dislike are difficult to conquer, and it was chiefly owing to the efforts of Lord Beaconsfield that they were eventually overcome. Imperialism too often means jingoism, wild waving of flags and chanting of such melodies as, "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too." The true imperialism is defence, not defiance. Beaconsfield looked back into the past and sought to resume the thread of our ancient empire. For him empire meant no easy burden, but a solemn duty, a knitting together of all the varied races and religions in one common cause. Peace with honour was his and England's watchword. He believed, in fact, like Shakespeare, in saying, "Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but, being in, bet that the foes may beware of thee." He was very particular on the duty of, if necessary, saying rough things kindly and not kind things roughly, which was a lesson Lord Palmerston never seemed to be capable of learning. Another of his maxims was that it was wiser from every point of view to treat semi-barbarous nations with due respect for their customs and feelings. He preached confederation and not annexation. By pursuing the policy of confederation, he declared, "We bind states together, we consolidate their resources, and we enable them to establish a strong frontier. That is the best security against annexation." His whole policy was to foster the growth of independence and build foundations of a peace which should be enduring. Both in the East and in the West our object is to have prosperous, happy and contented neighbours. The object of his imperialism was to progress, at the same time paying due respect to the traditions of the past. He rightly believed that the character of a nation, like that of an individual, is strengthened by responsibility. The glory of the Empire and the prosperity of the people was what he hoped to achieve. During the anxious times of the Indian Mutiny he alone seemed to grasp the real meaning of this sudden uprising of alien races. He declared that it was a revolt and not a mutiny, a revolt against the English because of their lack of respect for ancient rights and customs. After the war was ended he declared that the government ought to tell the people of India that the relation between them and their real ruler and sovereign, Queen Victoria, shall be drawn nearer. This should be done in the Queen's name and with the Queen's authority. He appealed to the whole Indian nation by his Royal Titles Bill, by means of which the Queen received the title of Empress of India. This brought home to the minds and imaginations of the native races the real meaning and grandeur of the empire of which they were now a part. The great Queen was now their Empress, or, to use the Indian title, Kaiser-i-Hind. The Queen took the deepest interest in the proclamation to the Indian people in 1858, and insisted on a number of alterations before she would allow it to be passed as satisfactory. She wrote to Lord Derby asking him to remember that "it is a female sovereign who speaks to more than 100 millions of Eastern people on assuming the direct government over them after a bloody civil war, giving them pledges which her future reign is to redeem, and explaining the principles of her government. Such a document should breathe feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious feeling, pointing out the privileges which the Indians will receive in being placed on an equality with the subjects of the British Crown, and the prosperity following in the train of civilization." Direct mention was to be made of the introduction of railways, canals, and telegraphs, with an assurance that such works would be the cause of general welfare to the Indian people. In conclusion, she added, Her Majesty wishes expression to be given to her feelings of horror and regret at the results of this bloody civil war, and of pleasure and gratitude to God at its approaching end, and Her Majesty thinks the proclamation should terminate by an invocation to Providence for its blessing on a great work for a great and good end." The amended proclamation was read in every province in India, and met everywhere with cordial approval by princes and natives alike. The feeling of loyalty was aroused by the Queen's assurance that "in your prosperity is our strength, in your contentment our security, and in your gratitude our best reward." On May 1st, 1859, in England, and on July 28th, 1859, in India, there was a general thanksgiving for the restoration of peace. Although the Queen was never able to visit India in person, in 1875 the Prince of Wales went, at her request, to mark her appreciation of the loyalty of the native princes. The welcome given to the future King of England was truly royal. Reviews, banquets, illuminations, state dinners followed one another in rapid succession. Benares, the sacred city of the Hindus, was visited, and here the Prince witnessed a great procession, which included large numbers of elephants and camels, and an illumination of the entire river and city. Benares, the sacred city of the Hindus, was visited, and here the Prince witnessed a great procession, which included large numbers of elephants and camels, and an illumination of the entire river and city. At Delhi, the capital of the Great Mogul, the Prince was met by Lord Napier of Magdala, at the head of 15,000 troops, and at Lucknow an address and a crown set with jewels were presented to him. It was in the same year that Disraeli, on behalf of the British Government, purchased a very large number of shares in the Suez Canal, thus gaining for us a hand in its administration, a vitally important matter when one realises how much closer India has been brought by this saving in time over the long voyage around the Cape. To pass in review the growth and expansion of the Empire during the Queen's reign would be a difficult task, and an impossible one within the limits of a small volume. The expressions of loyalty and devotion from the representatives of the great overseas dominions on the occasion of the Queen's Jubilee in 1887 were proof enough that England and the English were no longer an insular land and people, but a mighty nation with one sovereign head. In the address which was presented to the Queen, it was stated that during her reign her colonial subjects of European descent had increased from 2 to 9 millions, and in Asia and India there was an increase of population from 96 to 254 millions. After the great ceremony of Thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral, the Queen expressed her thanks to her people in the following message: "I am anxious to express to my people my warm thanks for the kind, and more than kind, reception I met with on going to and returning from Westminster Abbey with all my children and grandchildren. The enthusiastic reception I met with then, as well as on those eventful days in London, as well as in Windsor on the occasion of my Jubilee, has touched me most deeply, and has shown that the labours and anxieties of 50 long years, 22 years of which I spent in unclouded happiness, shared with and cheered by my beloved husband, while an equal number were full of sorrows and trial borne without his sheltering arm and wise help, have been appreciated by my people. This feeling and the sense of duty towards my dear country and subjects, who are so inseparably bound up with my life, will encourage me in my task, often a very difficult and arduous one, during the remainder of my life. The wonderful order preserved on this occasion, and the good behaviour of the enormous multitudes assembled, merits my highest admiration. That God may protect and abundantly bless my country is my fervent prayer." And in laying the foundation stone of the Imperial Institute, she said: "I concur with you in thinking that the counsel and exertions of my beloved husband initiated a movement which gave increased vigour to commercial activity, and produced marked and lasting improvements in industrial efforts. One indirect result of that movement has been to bring more before the minds of men the vast and varied resources of the empire over which Providence has willed that I should reign during 50 prosperous years. I believe and hope that the Imperial Institute will play a useful part in combining these resources for the common advantage of all my subjects, conducing towards the welding of the colonies, India and the mother country into one harmonious and united community. When war was declared in South Africa and the Boer forces invaded Cape Colony and Natal, contingents from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Cape Colony and Natal joined the British force and fought side by side throughout that long and trying campaign. In 1897 was celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Queen's reign, and every colony sent a detachment of troops to represent it. At the steps of St Paul's Cathedral the Queen remained to return thanks to God for all the blessings of her reign, and after the magnificent procession had returned she once again sent a message to her people. In weal and woe I have ever had the true sympathy of all my people, which has been warmly reciprocated by myself. It has given me unbounded pleasure to see so many of my subjects from all parts of the world assembled here, and to find them joining in the acclamations of loyal devotion to myself, and I wish to thank them all from the depth of my grateful heart. Appendix to Chapter 13. The British Empire. The population of the Empire is estimated to be 355 millions of coloured and 60 millions of white people. Canada. 1840. The Act of Union passed. The two colonies of Upper and Lower Canada united and a representative assembly formed. 1867. Bill for the Federation of Canada passed. The various provinces united under the title of Dominion of Canada, ruled by a Governor-General nominated by the Crown. The Central Parliament, which dealt with matters relating to the Dominion, established at Ottawa. 1885. Completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which led to the opening up of the North West. The great stream of emigration from Europe commences. Australia. Australia became a united Commonwealth at the beginning of the present century. From 1851 onward, the transportation of convicts was prohibited. The expansion of the Commonwealth has taken place to a great extent during the reign of Queen Victoria. The majority of the settlers are of British descent. South Africa. South Africa finally united in 1910 with self-government. India. Disraeli, in 1876, introduced the Royal Titles Bill, by means of which the Queen was able to assume the title of Empress of India. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 14. Stress and Strain. Forward, forward, let us range. Let the great world spin for ever down the ringing grooves of change. Tennyson. The greatest revolutions are not always those which are accompanied by riot and bloodshed. England's revolution was peaceful, but it worked vast and almost incredible changes. We find in the first place that after the great Napoleonic wars and during the 40 Years' Peace, a new class, the middle class, came into being. It had of course existed before this time, but it had been unable to make its power felt. The astonishing increase of trade and consequently of wealth, the application of steam power with special influence upon land and sea transit, transformed England into the workshop of the world. By the year 1840 railways were no longer regarded as something in the nature of an experiment, which might or might not prove a success. They had indeed become an integral part of the social life of the nation. In 1840 the Railway Regulation Act was passed, followed in 1844 by the Cheap Trains Act, which required that passengers must be carried in covered wagons at a charge of not more than 1 penny a mile and at a speed of not less than 12 miles an hour. From 1844 onward the construction of railways proceeded apace until by the year 1874 no less than 16,449 miles had been laid. Ocean traffic under steam progressed equally rapidly. In 1812 the first steamer appeared upon the Clyde, and in 1838 the famous Great Western steamed from Bristol to New York. The quickening and cheapening of transport called for new and improved methods of manufacture. Small business concerns grew into great mercantile houses with interests all over the face of the globe. Everywhere movement and expansion, everywhere change. A powerful commercial class came into existence, and power, that is, voting power, passed to this class and was held by it until the year 1865. From this year, roughly speaking, the power passed into the hands of the democracy. Education, which had been to a great extent a class monopoly, gradually penetrated to all ranks and grades of society. In 1867 the Second Reform Act was passed. A very large proportion of the urban working classes were given the power of voting, and it was naturally impossible to entrust such powers for long to an illiterate democracy. Therefore, in 1870, Mr Forster's Education Act was passed, which required that in every district where sufficient voluntary schools did not exist, a school board should be formed to build and maintain the necessary school accommodation at the cost of the rates. By a later Act of 1876, school attendance was made compulsory. Every effort was made in succeeding years to raise the level of intelligence among present and future citizens. Education became national and universal. During the period 1865 to 85, the population of the kingdom increased, and the emigration to the British colonial possessions reached its maximum in the year 1883, when the figures were 183,236. The rapid rise in population of the large towns drew attention more and more urgently to the question of public health. Every city and every town had its own problems to face, and the necessity for solving these cultivated and strengthened the sense of civic pride and responsibility. We find during this period an ever-growing interest throughout the country in the welfare, both moral and mental, of the great mass of the workers. Municipal life became the training ground where many a member of Parliament served his apprenticeship. Municipalities took charge of baths and washhouses, organised and built public markets, ensured a cheap and ample supply of pure water, installed modern systems of drainage, provided housing accommodation at low rents for the poor classes, built hospitals for infectious diseases, and finally carried on the great and important work of educating its citizens. The power of labour began at last to make itself felt. The first attempt at co-operation, made by the Rochdale pioneers in 1844, stimulated others to follow their example, and in 1869 the Co-operative Union was formed. The trade unions showed an increased interest in education, in forming libraries and classes, and in extending their somewhat narrow policy as their voting power increased. Out of this movement sprang working men's clubs attached to the unions and carrying on all branches of work, educational and beneficial, amongst its members. The standard of society was continually rising, and it was already a far cry to the early Victorian England described in an earlier chapter. The world was growing smaller, that is to say, communications between country and country, between continent and continent, were growing more easy. The first insulated cable was laid in 1848 across the Hudson River from Jersey City to New York, and in 1857 an unsuccessful attempt was made to connect the New and the Old World. In 1866 the Great Eastern, after 2 trials, succeeded in laying a complete cable. The expansion of the powers of human invention led to a great increase in the growth of comfort of all classes. To take only a few striking examples, at the beginning of the century matches were not yet invented, and only in 1827 were the Congreve sulphur matches put on the market. They were sold at the rate of 1 shilling a box, containing 84 matches. In the year 1821 gas was still considered a luxury. Soap and candles were both greatly improved and cheapened. By the withdrawal of the window tax in 1851, obvious and necessary advantages were gained in the building of houses. In 1855 the stamp duty on newspapers was abolished. In these days of cheap halfpenny papers with immense circulations, it is difficult to realise that at a date not very far distant from us the poor scarcely, if ever, saw a newspaper at all. Friends used to club together to reduce the great expense of buying a single copy, and agents hired out copies for the sum of 1 penny per hour. The only effect of the stamp duty had been to cut off the poorer classes from all sources of trustworthy information. In 1834 not a single town in the kingdom, with the exception of London, possessed a daily paper. The invention of steam printing and the introduction of shorthand reporting and the use of telegraph and railways revolutionised the whole world of journalism. Charles Dickens, on the occasion of his presiding, in May 1865, at the second annual dinner of the Newspaper Press Fund, gave his hearers an idea of what newspaper reporters were and what they had suffered in the early days. I had pursued the calling of a reporter under circumstances of which many of my brethren here can form no adequate conception. I have often transcribed for the printer, from my shorthand notes, important public speeches in which the strictest accuracy was required, and a mistake in which would have been to a young man severely compromising, writing on the palm of my hand by the light of a dark lantern in a post chaise and four, galloping through a wild country and through the dead of night, at the then surprising rate of 15 miles an hour. I have worn my knees by writing on them on the back row of the old gallery of the old House of Commons, and I have worn my feet by standing to write in a preposterous pen in the old House of Lords, where we used to be huddled together like so many sheep, kept in waiting, say until the woolsack might want restuffing, returning home from exciting political meetings in the country to the waiting press in London. I do verily believe I have been upset in almost every description of vehicle known in this country. I have been in my time belated on miry by roads, towards the small hours 40 or 50 miles from London, in a wheelless carriage with exhausted horses and drunken postboys, and have got back in time for publication, to be received with never forgotten compliments by the late Mr. Black, coming in the broadcast of Scotch from the broadest of hearts I ever knew. During these later years England came to look upon her duties and responsibilities towards her colonial possessions in quite a different light. Imperialism became a factor in the political life of the nation. The builders of empire in the time of Queen Elizabeth took a very narrow view of their responsibilities. They were not in the least degree concerned about the well-being of a colony or possession for its own sake. The state of Ireland in those days spoke for itself. The horrors of the Indian Mutiny in 1857 was the first lesson which opened England's eyes to the fact that an empire, if it is to be anything more than a name, must be a united whole under wise and sympathetic guidance. The rebellion proved to be the end of the old East Indian Company. England took over the administration of Indian affairs into her own hands. An Act for the Better Government of India was passed in 1858, which provided that all the territories previously under the government of the Company were to be vested in Her Majesty, and all the Company's powers to be exercised in her name. The Viceroy, with the assistance of a council, was to be supreme in India. In 1867 a great colonial reform was carried out, the Confederation of the North American Provinces of the British Empire. By this Act the names of Upper and Lower Canada were changed respectively to Ontario and Quebec. The first Dominion Parliament met in the autumn of the same year, and lost no time in passing an Act to construct an intercolonial railway affording proper means of communication between the maritime and central provinces. In 1869 the Hudson Bay Territory was acquired from the company which held it, and after the Red River insurrection, headed by a half-breed Louis Riel, had been successfully crushed by the Wolseley expedition, the territory was made part of the Federation. In 1871 British Columbia became part of the Dominion, on condition that a railway was constructed within the following 10 years, which should extend from the Pacific to the Rocky Mountains and connect with the existing railway system. The Great Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, opening out the West to all comers. The rise and growth of the imperialistic spirit had been greatly influenced by the literature on the subject, which dated its commencement from Professor Seeley's Expansion of England in 1883. This was followed by an immense number of works by various writers, the chief of whom, Rudyard Kipling, has popularised the conception of imperialism and extended its meaning. Never was isle so little, never was sea so lone, but over the scud and the palm trees an English flag was flown. The empire was not, however, to be consolidated without war and bloodshed, for relations with the two Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange River, became more and more strained as years went on. The last years of the Queen's life were destined to be saddened by the outbreak of war in South Africa. The facts which led to the outbreak were briefly these, though it is but fair to state that there are, even now, various theories current as to the causes. The discovery and opening up of the gold mines of the Transvaal had brought a stream of adventurous emigrants into the country, and it was these outlanders of whom the Dutch were suspicious. The Transvaal government refused to admit them to equal political rights with the Dutch inhabitants. It was certain, however, that the outlanders would never submit to be dependent on the policy of President Kruger, although the Dutch declared that they had only accepted the suzerainty of Great Britain under compulsion. Negotiations between the two governments led to nothing, as neither side would give way, and at last in 1899, following upon an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of British troops from the borders of the Republic, war broke out. It had undoubtedly been hastened by the ill-fated and ill-advised raid in 1896 of Dr. Jameson, the administrator of Rhodesia. It is scarcely necessary to review the details of this war at any length. It proved conclusively that the government of this country had vastly underrated the resisting powers of the Boers. For 3 years the British Army was forced to wage a guerrilla warfare and adapt itself to entirely new methods of campaigning. On May 28, 1900, the Orange Free State was annexed under the name of the Orange River Colony. In June, Lord Roberts entered Pretoria, but the war dragged on until 1902, when a peace conference was held and the Boer republics became part of the British Empire. Very liberal terms were offered to and accepted by the conquered Dutch. But long before this event took place, Queen Victoria had passed away. She had followed the whole course of the war with the deepest interest and anxiety, and when Lord Roberts returned to this country, leaving Lord Kitchener in command in South Africa, the Queen was desirous of hearing from his own lips the story of the campaign. The public was already uneasy about the state of her health, and on January 20th it was announced that her condition had become serious. On Tuesday, January the 22nd, she was conscious and recognised the members of her family watching by her bedside, but on the afternoon of the same day she peacefully passed away. One of the last wishes she expressed was that her body should be borne to rest on a gun carriage, for she had never forgotten that she was a soldier's daughter. On the day of the funeral, the horses attached to the gun carriage became restive, and the sailors who formed the guard of honour took their place and drew the coffin, draped in the Union Jack, to its last resting place. Through the streets of London, which had witnessed 2 great Jubilee processions, festivals of rejoicing and thanksgiving, the funeral cortège passed, and a great reign and a great epoch in history had come to an end. End of chapter 14. Queen Victoria. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 15. Victoria the Great. The keynote of Queen Victoria's life was simplicity. She was a great ruler, and at the same time a simple-minded, sympathetic woman, the true mother of her people. She seemed by some natural instinct to understand their joys and their sorrows, and this was the more remarkable, as for 40 years she reigned alone without the invaluable advice and assistance of her husband. Her qualities were not those which have made other great rulers famous, but they were typical of the age in which she lived. All her life she was industrious, and never spared herself any time or trouble, however arduous and disagreeable her duties might be. She possessed the keenest sense of duty, and in dealing with men and circumstances she never failed to do or say the right thing. Her daily intercourse with the leading English statesmen of the time gave her an unrivalled knowledge of home and foreign politics. In short, her natural ability and good sense, strengthened by experience, made her what she was, a perfect model of a constitutional monarch. During her reign the crown once again took its proper place. No longer was there a gulf between the ruler and the people, and patriotism, the love of Queen and country, became a real and living thing. Pope's adage, "A patriot is a fool in every age," could no longer be quoted with any truth. Queen Victoria was, above all, a great lover of peace, and did all in her power for its promotion. Her personal influence was often the means of smoothing over difficulties both at home and abroad, when her ministers had aggravated instead of lessening them. She formed her own opinions and held to them, though she was always willing to listen to reason. The memorandum which she drew up in the year 1850 shows how firm a stand she could take when her country's peace seemed to be threatened. Lord Palmerston, though an able minister in many respects, was a wilful, hot-headed man, who was over fond of acting on the spur of the moment, without consulting his sovereign. His dispatches, written as they so often were in a moment of feverish enthusiasm, frequently gave offence to foreign monarchs and statesmen, and were more than once nearly the cause of war. It was remarked of him that "the desk was his place of peril, his pen ran away with him." His speech never made an enemy, his writing has left many festering sores. The charm of manner and urbanity which so served him in Parliament and in society was sometimes wanting on paper, and good counsels were dashed with asperity. Lord Palmerston, the Queen complained, did not obey instructions, and she declared that before important dispatches were sent abroad the Sovereign should be consulted. Further, alterations were sometimes made by him when they had been neither suggested nor approved by the Crown. Such proceedings caused England, in the Queen's own words, to be "generally detested, mistrusted, and treated with indignity by even the smallest powers." In the memorandum the Queen requires 1. That he will distinctly state what he proposes in a given case, in order that the Queen may know as distinctly to what she has given her royal sanction. 2. Having once given her sanction to a measure, that it be not arbitrarily altered or modified by the Minister. Such an act she must consider as a failure in sincerity towards the Crown, and justly to be visited by the exercise of her constitutional right of dismissing the Minister. She expects to be kept informed of what passes between him and the foreign ministers before important decisions are taken, based upon that intercourse, to receive the foreign dispatches in good time, and to have the drafts for her approval sent to her in sufficient time to make herself acquainted with their contents before they must be sent off. The Queen thinks it best that Lord John Russell should show this letter to Lord Palmerston. More than once the alteration of a dispatch by the Queen prevented what might easily have plunged this country into a disastrous war. After the mutiny in India, a proclamation was issued to the native races, and the Queen insisted upon alterations which would clearly show that their religious beliefs should in no way be interfered with, thus preventing a fresh mutiny. On rare occasions her indignation got the better of her. Once, notably, when, owing to careless delay on the part of the Ministry, General Gordon perished at Khartoum, a rescue party failing to reach him in time. In a letter to his sisters she spoke of this as "a stain left upon England," and as a wrong which she felt very keenly. Her style of writing was as simple as possible, yet she always said the right thing at the right moment, and her letters of sympathy or congratulation were models of their kind and never failed in their effect. Few, if any, reigns in history have been so blameless as hers, and her domestic life was perfect in its harmony and the devotion of the members of her family to one another. She possessed the eye of the mistress for every detail, however small, which concerned housekeeping matters, and though her style of entertaining was naturally often magnificent, everything was paid for punctually. After the visits of King Louis Philippe and the Emperor Nicholas of Russia, Sir Robert Peel acknowledged that Her Majesty was able to meet every charge and to give a reception to the sovereigns which struck everyone by its magnificence, without adding one title to the burdens of the country. I am not required by Her Majesty to press for the extra expenditure of one single shilling on account of these unforeseen causes of increased expenditure. I think that to state this is only due to the personal credit of Her Majesty, who insists upon it that there shall be every magnificence required by her station, but without incurring one single debt. When one remembers that the Queen had to superintend the household arrangements of Buckingham Palace, Balmoral Castle, Osborne and Windsor, and that the latter alone gave employment in one way and another to 2,000 people, it can be realised that this was a tremendous undertaking in itself. Method and neatness, first instituted by the Prince Consort, were always insisted upon in place of the disorder and waste which had reigned supreme before the Queen became head of the household. Before her life was saddened by the untimely loss of her husband, the Queen was the leader of English society, and her influence was, as may be imagined, thoroughly wholesome and good. She was all her life a deeply religious woman, and though her observance of Sunday was strict, she never allowed it to become a day of penance. Her religion was humane indeed. Her intense sympathy with all sorrow and suffering was one of her supreme virtues, and her early upbringing made her dislike all elaborate forms of ceremony during the service. When in the Highlands she always attended the simple little Presbyterian church, where the congregation was, for the most part, made up of the inhabitants of the neighbourhood. It is this simplicity and homeliness of the Queen which was so often misunderstood by those who could not realise how much she was at one with her people. The Queen was never more happy than when she was visiting some poor sufferer and comforting those in sorrow. Her memory for the little events which made up the lives and happiness of those far below her in social rank was amazing. She was a great and truly democratic Queen. She gave the greater portion of her Jubilee present toward a fund to establish institutions to provide nurses for the sick poor. During the latter years of her reign, when she was less and less to be seen at public functions and ceremonies, many complaints were made about her reputed neglect of royal duties. She felt the injustice of such statements very keenly, and with good reason. No allowances were made for her poor health, for her years, for the family losses which left her every year more and more a lonely woman. Her duties, ever increasing in number and extent, left her no time, even if she had possessed the inclination, to take part in pomp and ceremony. The outburst of loyalty and affection on the occasion of her 2 Jubilee celebrations proved that she still reigned supreme in the nation's heart. The Queen was not only a great monarch, but also a great statesman. Consider for a moment the many and bewildering changes which took place in her own and other countries during her reign. Our country was almost continually at war in some portion of the globe. The British army fought side by side with the French against Russia in the Crimea, and against the rebels in the Indian Mutiny. 2 Boer wars were fought in South Africa in 1881 and 1899 to 1902. There were also lesser wars in China, Afghanistan, Abyssinia, Zululand and Egypt. The Queen lived to see France change from a monarchy to a republic, to see Germany beat France to her knees and become a united empire, thanks to the foresight of her great statesman Bismarck and her great general von Moltke. During the same year, 1870, the Italian army entered Rome as soon as the French garrison had been withdrawn, and Italy became a united country under King Victor Emmanuel. Despite the fact that the map of Europe was continually changing, England managed to keep clear of international strife, and this was in no small degree due to the personal influence of the Queen. The England of her early years would be an absolutely foreign country to us if by some magic touch we were to be transplanted back down the line of years. It was different in thought, feeling and outlook. The extraordinary changes in the modes of travelling, by means of which numbers of people who had never even thought of any other country besides their own were enabled to visit other lands, broke down bit by bit the barrier between the continent and ourselves. England became less of an insular and more of a continental power. The social changes were, as has been shown, all for good. Education became not the privilege of the few, but the right of all who wished for it. Step by step the people gained in power and in the right to govern themselves. The idea of citizenship, of a patriotism which extended beyond the narrow limits of these isles, slowly took root and blossomed. Through all these manifold changes the Queen reigned, ever alert, and even in her last years taking the keenest interest in the growth of her mighty kingdom. To use of the Queen in a dignified capacity is incalculable, declared Walter Bagehot in his famous essay on The English Constitution. He continues, "Without her in England, the present English government would fail and pass away. It is interesting to read the reasons which such a clear and distinguished thinker gives to explain the hold which the monarchy retains upon the English nation as a whole. Firstly, there is the family, of which the Queen is the head. The nation looks upon her as its mother. Witness its enthusiasm at the marriage of the Prince of Wales. Secondly, the monarchy strengthens the government with the strength of religion. It is the duty of a loyal citizen to obey his Queen. The oath of allegiance is no empty form. The Queen, from her very position, acts as a symbol of unity. Thirdly, the Queen is the head of our society. She represents England in the eyes of foreign nations. Fourthly, the monarchy is the head of our morality. The example of Queen Victoria's simple life has not been lost upon the nation. It is now quite a natural thing to expect and to find the domestic virtues personified in the ruling monarch, and this in spite of the fact that history has shown what temptations lie in the way of those possessed of the highest power in the state. Shakespeare voiced the feeling of the people for the kingship in the words which he put in the mouth of Henry V. Upon the king let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children and our sins lay on the king. We must bear all. O hard condition, twin born with greatness, subject to the breath of every fool, whose sense no more can feel but his own wringing. What infinite heart's ease must kings neglect, that private men enjoy? And what have kings that privates have not too, save ceremony, save general ceremony? And lastly, the actual government of the country may change, but the monarch remains, subject to no changes of Parliament, above and aloof from the strife of political parties, the steadying influence in times of transition. The sovereign has three rights: the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, the right to warn. A comparison of the reigns of the four Georges with the reign of Queen Victoria shows that it was only during the latter's reign that the duties of the constitutional monarch were well and conscientiously performed. The Queen worked as well as her ministers, and was their equal and often their superior in business capacity. To conclude, the benefits of a good monarch are almost invaluable, but the evils of a bad monarch are almost irreparable. On the death of the Queen, Mr. Arthur Balfour, speaking in the House of Commons, described his visit to Osborne at a time when the royal family was already in mourning. The Queen's desk was still littered with papers, the inkstand still open, and the pen laid beside it. She passed away with her children, and her children's children, to the third generation around her. Beloved and cherished of all, she passed away without, I well believe, a single enemy in the world. Even those who loved not England loved her. She passed away not only knowing that she was, I had almost said, worshipped and reverenced by all her subjects, but that their feelings towards her had grown in depth and intensity with every year she was spared to rule over us. End of chapter 15. Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 16. Appendix. Victoria Alexandrina, only daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent, fourth son of George III, born at Kensington, May 24, 1819, became Queen June 20, 1837. Married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Prince Consort, born August 26, 1819, died December 14, 1861. Died January 22, 1901, after a reign of 63 years. Summary of chief events during the Queen's reign. 1838. Commencement of the Chartist movement. 1840. Penny postage established mainly through the efforts of Rowland Hill. War with China. 1841. Sir Robert Peel appointed Premier. 1842. War with Afghanistan, peace with China, the Chinese cede Hong Kong. 1843. Agitation in Ireland for the repeal of the Union. Arrest of Daniel O'Connell. 1845. War with the Sikhs. Failure of potato crop in Ireland, which resulted in a famine in the following winter. 1846. Repeal of the Corn Laws. Lord John Russell appointed Premier. 1848. Revolution in France. Prince Louis Napoleon becomes President of the Republic. Chartist agitation in London. 1849. Annexation of the Punjab. 1850. Death of Sir Robert Peel. 1851, the Great Exhibition. 1852, Death of the Duke of Wellington, Louis Napoleon elected Emperor of France. 1853, Turkey declares war against Russia. 1854, Great Britain and France declare war against Russia. The Crimean War. Invasion of the Crimea. The Battle of the Alma, September 20th. Siege of Sebastopol, Battle of Balaclava and charge of the Light Brigade, October 25th. Battle of Inkerman, November the 5th. 1855, Lord Palmerston appointed Premier. Death of the Emperor Nicholas of Russia. Fall of Sebastopol in September. 1856, peace concluded with Russia by the Treaty of Paris. 1857, the Indian Mutiny. The massacre at Cawnpore in July. Capture of Delhi, September. Sir Colin Campbell relieves Lucknow, November. 1858, suppression of the mutiny. Abolition of the East India Company. The possessions and powers of the company transferred to the Crown. The Queen's proclamation to India, issued by Lord Canning, first Viceroy. 1859, establishment of the Volunteer Army. Fenianism in Ireland. Trial of O'Donovan Rossa. 1860, Second Chinese War and occupation of Peking. 1861, the American Civil War. Repeal of the duty on paper. 1862, the Second Great Exhibition. 1865, death of Lord Palmerston. Lord Russell appointed Premier. 1866, the Atlantic Cable laid. Lord Derby appointed Premier. The war between Austria and Prussia. 1867, the Second Reform Bill passed. It largely extended the suffrage in English boroughs. 1868, Disraeli appointed Premier. 1869, Suez Canal opened. 1870, the Elementary Education Act passed, which compelled the attendance of children at efficient schools. The Franco-German War. Halfpenny postcards first came into use. 1871, establishment of the German Empire. Treaty of Washington, which settled by arbitration the Alabama claims. 1872, the Ballot Act passed to secure secret voting at elections. 1874, Disraeli appointed Premier for the second time. 1875, purchase of shares in the Suez Canal. 1876, Disraeli becomes Earl of Beaconsfield. The Queen proclaimed Empress of India. 1878, Congress of Berlin to settle the Eastern Question. Great Britain was represented by Lord Salisbury and Beaconsfield. Second Afghan War. 1879, War in Zululand. 1880, Rising of the Boers in Transvaal. 1881, defeat of the British at Majuba Hill. Peace concluded in March. Death of Lord Beaconsfield. 1882, occupation of Egypt. Bombardment of Alexandria and the Battle of Tel El Kebir. 1883, War in the Sudan. Defeat of Hicks Pasha. 1885, fall of Khartoum and death of General Gordon. Redistribution Bill. Numbers of members of Parliament increased from 658 to 670. The revised version of the Bible. 1886, annexation of Upper Burma. 1887, Jubilee celebration. 1888, death of the Emperor William I of Germany and of his son Frederick III. Succession of William II. The Local Government Act, by which England and Wales was divided into counties and county boroughs for purposes of local government. 1889, charter granted to British South African Company. 1896, the Jameson Raid. 1897, the Diamond Jubilee. 1898, death of Gladstone. War in Sudan. Battle of Omdurman. 1899, South African War. End of chapter 16. End of Queen Victoria by E. Gordon Browne.